history often forgets the stories that shaped us. The Yamasee War of 1715 was a brutal conflict that shook colonial South Carolina, erupting from years of exploitation and injustice. The violence was devastating, nearly collapsing the colony and forever altering the American Southeast. Remembering the Yamasee War helps us confront the erased stories and resilience that define our history. The Yamasee were a powerful confederation of indigenous groups in the coastal South, described as dark-skinned and often called black or Negroes by colonists. Their unique identity, shaped by ancient connections with Africans, baffled Europeans, and led to deliberate erasure. Colonists reclassified them as black, justifying land seizure and enslavement. Today, reclaiming Yamasee history challenges us to see the true, complex roots of America. The Yamasee were not a single tribe, but a confederation of diverse nations, united in the coastal plains of South Carolina and Georgia. Their society was complex and matrilineal, with lineage traced through mothers, ensuring their identity endured across generations. This confederated, inclusive structure allowed them to adapt, welcome newcomers, and remain resilient, even after war and upheaval. A defining characteristic of the Yamasee, repeatedly mentioned in colonial documents, was their physical appearance. European observers, from Spanish missionaries to British traders, consistently described them as a dark-skinned people, often using terms that highlighted their deep, copper-toned or reddish-brown complexions. Many accounts explicitly referred to them as Black Indians or even Negroes, distinguishing them from other, lighter-skinned tribes. This physical description is not a matter of mere curiosity. It is a central clue to understanding their ancient and complex heritage, one that challenges the conventional timelines of cross-continental contact that are taught in most history classes today. This distinct appearance was not, as some have mistakenly assumed, primarily the result of mixing with Africans brought to America during the transatlantic slave trade. The historical timeline simply does not support this narrow view. The heritage of the Yamasee and other indigenous peoples of the Americas is interwoven with African roots that stretch back millennia before Columbus. Ancient trade, exploration, and migration between Africa and the Americas created a genetic and cultural tapestry that was already ancient by the time Europeans arrived. The Yamasee were one of many groups who were the living embodiment of these pre-Columbian connections between continents. Compelling evidence suggests significant exchanges, including the possibility that West African fleets, such as those reputedly sent by the Malian Emperor Mansa Musa in the early 14th century, reached the Americas. These explorers and traders would have encountered and intermingled with local populations, including the ancestors of the Yamasee. This interaction was not a conquest, but a process of cultural and genetic exchange, enriching the societies that participated. The Yamasee, therefore, were not mixed race in the modern sense, but were an authentically indigenous people, whose ancestry reflected a global history far older and more complex than European-centric narratives allow. By acknowledging these ancient roots, we can see the Yamasee in a new light. Their dark skin was not an anomaly, but a marker of a deep ancestral heritage. It set them apart in the eyes of the colonists, who struggled to fit them into their newly forming racial hierarchies. For the Yamasee, their identity was whole and unbroken, rooted in the lands their ancestors had inhabited for generations and connected to a wider world of ancient history. This rich heritage was a source of pride and strength, one that the colonists would seek to systematically dismantle and erase in their quest for domination and control. The British colonists erased the Yamasee from official records, reclassifying them as Negro or colored, a devastating act of paper genocide. This stripped the Yamasee of their land, rights, and identity, forcing them into the lowest rungs of colonial society. Today, their descendants fight to reclaim their true heritage, challenging centuries of erasure. The Yamasee and British colonists once thrived on deerskin trade, exchanging pelts for guns and tools. But as demand grew, so did colonial greed and debt. Traders exploited the Yamasee with credit, unfair deals, and rigged scales, trapping them in mounting debt. What began as partnership became economic oppression, sowing the seeds of conflict. In early South Carolina, the trade in Indian slaves was a central pillar of the economy. Before so-called African slavery dominated, which is a lie, thousands of indigenous people were captured and sold in Charlestown's markets, who could pass as Africans. The Yamasee soon became its victims as colonial demand grew insatiable. Betrayed by their allies, every Yamasee man, woman, and child now faced the terrifying threat of enslavement. The enslavement of Yamasee women and children was the final, unforgivable offense. In their matrilineal society, women were the heart of the clan. An attack on them was an attack on the nation's future. British traders seized women and children as payment for debts, showing total disregard for Yamasee sovereignty and humanity. This injustice was the spark that ignited war, as the Yamasee and their allies prepared to fight back. The breaking point had been reached. Years of betrayal and stolen land forged a secret alliance among the Yamasee and their neighbors. On April 15, 1715, as dawn broke, Yamasee warriors struck the British delegation in Pocataligo, launching a wave of coordinated attacks. The bloody dawn was not just violence, it was the birth of a revolution, as the Yamasee reclaimed their destiny. The flames of war spread from Pocataligo, engulfing South Carolina's frontier. The Yamasee and their allies struck with fury, overrunning plantations and forcing terrified colonists to flee. The southern colony collapsed into chaos, its wealth reduced to ruins. Refugees flooded Charlestown as the war reached the city's doorstep. The Yamasee had brought the colony to the brink of collapse. The British colonists, trained in European warfare, were unprepared for the Yamasee's tactics. Instead of open battle, indigenous warriors used the forests and swamps to their advantage, striking swiftly and vanishing. Ambushes, disrupted supply lines, and constant fear plagued the colonists. The forest became a deadly maze, every shadow a threat. Guerrilla tactics neutralized colonial firepower, inflicting heavy casualties. Nearly 400 settlers died, almost 10% of South Carolina's white population. The Yamasee targeted those most responsible for their suffering, delivering retribution with precision. Their mastery of the land and unconventional warfare kept the colonists on the defensive. The British could not force a decisive battle. The Yamasee refused to fight by their rules. This asymmetric warfare defined the conflict's brutal first year. The Yamasee's early victories left South Carolina in chaos, its capital flooded with refugees. Realizing brute force had failed, Governor Craven and his council turned to diplomacy. The British sought to divide the indigenous alliance, targeting neutral or wavering tribes. Promises of trade, weapons, and peace were offered to those who would abandon the Yamasee. British agents risked everything, negotiating with tribal leaders deep in the interior. The colonists dangled the prospect of power and partnership to entice new allies. Control of European goods, especially firearms, forced tribes to choose sides. Neutrality was no longer an option. The war's next phase would be fought as much in council lodges as on battlefields. The British gambled everything on turning former enemies into allies. The stage was set for a dramatic shift in the war's balance. The Cherokee, powerful and still neutral, became the focus of both sides' diplomacy. The Yamasee urged unity against colonial expansion, warning the Cherokee they'd be next. The British offered trade, recognition, and help against the Creeks, the Cherokee's old rivals. Cherokee leaders debated fiercely. Some distrusted the British, others saw opportunity. Ultimately, pragmatism won. In late 1715, the Cherokee allied with the British. This alliance tipped the scales, trapping the Yamasee in a two-front war. The British gained thousands of new fighters. The dream of a united indigenous resistance collapsed. The Yamasee and their allies now faced overwhelming odds. The Cherokee's decision marked the war's turning point. The tide had turned decisively against the Yamasee. With Cherokee support, the British launched an offensive into Yamasee territory. Governor Craven led a major expedition to the Yamasee stronghold on the Salkehatchie River. The Yamasee prepared a hidden, fortified position, hoping to halt the advance. The battle was fierce. Yamasee gunfire stalled the initial assault, inflicting heavy losses. But British and Cherokee numbers overwhelmed the defenders. Flanked and outnumbered, the Yamasee were forced to retreat after brutal fighting. The loss of their main camp shattered their resistance. The Battle of Salkehatchie ended organized Yamasee opposition in South Carolina. The colonists reclaimed lost territory. The war's outcome was now all but certain. The defeat at Salkehatchie broke the Yamasee alliance. Demoralized and scattered, the Yamasee lost their base and their allies' support. The Creeks and others, seeing no hope, made peace with the British. The British negotiated separate treaties, isolating the Yamasee. The dream of indigenous unity was shattered. Branded as the main instigators, the Yamasee faced destruction or exile. With no allies and their lands lost, they fled south. The Spanish in Florida offered refuge, but the Yamasee's power was gone. The war ended in fragmentation and exile for the Yamasee. Colonial divide-and-conquer tactics had prevailed. Defeated and abandoned, the Yamasee chose exile over annihilation. They began a perilous migration south, leaving behind their ancestral lands. The journey was deadly. Many died from hunger, disease, or attacks. The Spanish in St. Augustine welcomed them as a buffer against the British. For the colonists, Yamasee flight meant victory and new lands for plantations. The Carolina Lowcountry was quickly claimed and settled by the British. The Yamasee saw their migration as survival, not surrender. In Florida, they struggled to rebuild, carrying memories of their lost homeland. Their enmity for the British endured, fueling future border conflicts. The Yamasee story continued, marked by resilience and loss. After the Yamasee were forced from South Carolina, British colonists erased them from history, physically and on paper. Their name was crossed out, their memory declared extinct, and their land claimed. Survivors were relabeled as Seminole, Creek, or Negro, making it seem as if the Yamasee vanished. But their descendants endure, still fighting to reclaim the Yamasee name. Driven into the unfamiliar landscape of Florida, the scattered Yamasee survivors did not remain isolated. Survival depended on forging new communities and alliances. They found refuge among other indigenous peoples who were also resisting colonial pressures, primarily the Yuchi, and the various bands of lower creeks who were themselves migrating into Florida. This process of coming together, of blending different cultures, languages, and traditions out of shared necessity, was the genesis of a new and powerful indigenous identity: the Seminole. The Yamasee were not simply absorbed into other tribes, they became a foundational element of what it meant to be Seminole. The Seminole Nation was, from its very beginning, a multi-ethnic and multilingual confederacy, defined not by a single ancestral lineage, but by a shared commitment to resistance and independence from encroaching colonial powers. The Yamasee, with their deep-seated hatred of the British and their experience in guerrilla warfare, fit naturally into this emerging society. They brought with them their matrilineal traditions, their agricultural knowledge, and their resilient spirit. Historical records and oral traditions from the period show Yamasee leaders and clans playing significant roles in the early formation of the Seminole Confederacy, contributing to its military strength and cultural fabric. The amalgamation was not limited to the Seminoles. Some Yamasee bands moved westward, joining with tribes like the Blackfoot, who also shared a heritage of being a dark-skinned indigenous people. This diaspora spread Yamasee bloodlines and cultural influences across the Southeast. The very names given to these integrated groups, such as the Yamasee Seminoles, acknowledge their distinct contribution. This blending of peoples demonstrates the fluidity of indigenous identity, which was often based more on political allegiance and kinship than on the rigid racial and tribal labels imposed by Europeans. The Yamasee did not vanish. They evolved, becoming integral parts of new and powerful collective identities. This process of amalgamation is a story of incredible resilience. Instead of fading into extinction as the British narrative claimed, the Yamasee adapted to their new circumstances by embedding themselves within larger networks of resistance. They transformed the catastrophe of their defeat and exile into an opportunity to build a new future. Their story becomes woven into the larger story of the Seminole, Yuchi, and other tribes who fought to maintain their autonomy in the face of relentless colonial expansion. The Yamasee spirit of defiance lived on, fueling the flames of the Seminole Wars that would challenge the United States for decades to come. The Yamasee survived because of their matrilineal society. Identity, clan, and status passed through mothers. As long as Yamasee mothers lived, so did the nation. This matrilineal principle shielded them from erasure, preserving their identity through generations. Today, Yamasee descendants reclaim their heritage, proving they were never extinct. They survived. The Yamasee War forever changed the American Southeast, exposing the violence and greed behind colonial expansion. South Carolina's near destruction forced a shift to African slavery, they say, and new policies toward indigenous peoples. But they kept enslaving indigenous people and reclassifying them as African slaves, teaching their children a false narrative that they were brought over to America as slaves on slave ships. The war shattered native power, exiling the Yamasee and elevating the Cherokee, while divide-and-conquer tactics kept tribes apart. Yet, the Yamasee spirit endured, reborn in the Seminole Nation, reminding us of the true cost and resilience in the face of colonization. Active Chief Black Eagle Thunderbird of the Yamasee tribe of Native Americans, Seminole, Washita Mound Builders, known as Malachi Z. York L., who is being held as a political prisoner since May 2002 by the USA Corporation under false pretext. They are a branch of the Washita Moors called Yamasee, migrated to an area of Georgia in the United States called Rock Eagle Mound that was built by the earlier mound builders. The Yamasee or Yamasee were a gentle tribe of black Native Americans who even practiced their ancient Moorish religion of Islam. The word Yamasee means gentle. The tribe lived along the Ocmulgee River, not far above its junction with the Oconee. In 1715, the Yamasee rose in rebellion against the English who started getting involved in slavery. The Yamasee was eventually pushed into Florida and allied with the Spaniards. Some Yamasee remained in the neighborhood of the St. Johns River until the outbreak of the Seminole War. Many of the Yamasee mixed in with the Seminole and moved to Oklahoma. In 1730, some of the Yamasee settled on the site of what is now Savannah, Georgia, and took on the name Yamacraw. The Yamasee originally resided in Georgia but moved to the Carolinas when Spanish settlers pushed them out of Savannah. The Yamasee then became allies with the British in the Tuscarora War of 1711. Just as the Spaniards did, the British as well turned on the Yamasee and took advantage of their gentle nature. After the Tuscarora War, the British took the Yamasee land at gunpoint and refused to pay the tribe for the land. The British then captured Yamasee women and children and sold them into slavery. In retaliation, the Yamasee gathered their relative neighboring tribes of the Appalachians, Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Creek Confederation, the fearsome Catawbas, and the Cherokees. This event was one of the largest Native American war parties in history, called the Yamasee Uprising. The Catawbas was formed from the remnants of other Native American tribes that were massacred by war and epidemics of the 17th century. The main tribes of the Catawba were made up of the Chowan, Kangaree, Nachi, Coosa, and the Yamasee. The term Catawba comes from the Yuchi words ko, meaning people, and taba, meaning strong. The name Catawba was used primarily after 1715, but the name that this group originally went by was Iswa. The Iswas called themselves Iyeye and Nyeye, which means real people, and were in reference to them being the original Native Americans who were black. The Iswa are mentioned in early Spanish records by the name of Iza when referring to the Black Moors of Spain. The word Iza is an Ashuric Syriac Arabic word used by Muslims for Jesus, and the language of the Moors was Arabic. The Olmecs spoke a dialect of Nuabu, which is an Akkadian dialect of Nubia in Africa. In 1736, the Catawbas joined the Muskogee. After the 1715 war, Native American power collapsed in the South. Many of the Yamasee escaped to Florida, joining other outlaw tribes to form what would later be called the Seminole. The nucleus of the Seminole tribe was the Oconee, who lived along the Oconee River in Georgia. The Oconee were part Hitchiti. The Oconee emigrated from the Oconee River westward to the Chattahoochee River, where they mixed in with the lower creeks. Many of these bands began to settle in Florida and became known as Seminole, which means runaway. They lie and say they were runaway slaves, but they were members of outlaw tribes who resisted colonization. 5 tribes made up the Seminole, which were the Oconee, Yamasee, Apalachicola, Yuchi, and Lower Creeks. In 1729, a Cashita chief named Captain Ellick married 3 Yuchi women and persuaded some of the Yuchi to move in with the Creeks. But Governor Oglethorpe of Georgia, fearing this mass joining of the 2 nations, agreed to give the Yuchi the rights to their own land. The final seize of land did not occur until 1751. The U.S. government's concern was to keep the Indian nations segregated for fear of a mass uprising. Many of the Yamasee and the Oconee decided not to intermarry into the Red tribes and decided to keep their original black dark ancestry. Other Oconees and Yamasee did in fact mix with other nations and produced black factions in almost every Aboriginal tribe. There is a saying in the Shoshone tribe that states, "coming full circle," in which is in reference to the original natives having African features, but being in America before Columbus. Some believe losing their Moorish American blood due to the mixing with Asians and dark and pale Europeans, and thousands of years later, mixing back into the vine. The Seminole are one of the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma. More than any other of these tribes, they are a cosmopolitan Indian group. Both their men and their women have always been remarkable in their appearance. The men, particularly in the Tiger clan, have a dark copper-colored complexion. They are well developed in muscle and limb and are capable of great physical endurance. A large head, square chest and face, and slightly aquiline nose are tribal characteristics. The women generally tend to average height or less. One ethnologist has stated that the 3 representative types of a handsome and pretty and comely woman be selected from the Seminole as the first tribe in rank among the American Indians for fine-looking women. The Yamasee Indians are best known for their involvement in the Indian slave trade and the 18th century war, 1715–54, that took their name. Yet their significance in colonial history is far larger than that. Denise Thurbossy brings together archaeologists of South Carolina and Florida with historians of the native South, Spanish Florida, and British Carolina for the first time to answer elusive questions about the Yamasee's identity, history, and fate. Until now, scholarly works have rarely focused on the Yamasees themselves. In Southern history, the Yamasees appear only sporadically outside of slave raiding or the Yamasee War. Their culture and political structures, the complexities of their many migrations, their kinship networks, and their survival remain largely uninvestigated. The Yamasees' relative obscurity in scholarship is partly a result of their geographic mobility. Reconstructing their past has posed a real challenge in light of their many, often overlapping, migrations. In addition, the campaigns waged by the British, and the Americans after them, in order to erase the Yamasees from the South, forced Yamasee survivors to camouflage bit by bit their identities. The Yamasee Indians recovers the complex history of these peoples. In this critically important new volume, historians and archaeologists weave together the fractured narratives of the Yamasees through probing questions about their mobility, identity, and networks. Remembering the Yamasee War is an act of historical justice, restoring erased names and stories, and challenging the myth of extinction. The Yamasee, Black Indians, defied rigid racial categories and survived against all odds. By reclaiming their history, we honor their resilience and empower their descendants today. The Yamasee, a people who refuse to vanish, demand that we remember